This is the third module in our research ethics overview. In this module, we will cover a number of important issues you should consider in preparing to undertake a research project if human participants are involved. In this module, we will briefly discuss the issue of risk and levels of risk, research involving vulnerable populations, recruitment of participants, informed consent and departures from the principles of consent, data privacy and security, and permissions you may require from outside agencies or institutions. The TCPS-2 requires that REB review of proposed research should be proportional. That means that the rigor of REB review should be greater for more risky studies and less rigorous when the risks to which participants are exposed is low. At an initial matter, the Office determines, for each proposed study, whether the risk posed to participants is minimal or greater than minimal. The level of review depends on whether the study poses minimal or greater than minimal risk to participants. As you can see, a study is minimal risk when the probability and magnitude of harms are no greater than those encountered by the participant population in their everyday lives. For example, most survey and interview studies qualify as minimal risk, so long as the subject matter of the questions are not particularly sensitive or likely to be emotionally triggering to the respondents. However, if the study poses more than such everyday minimal risks, then a stricter review process is used. Minimal risk research is reviewed by the appropriate research ethics coordinator, one or two REB board members, and the chair of the REB. If, however, a project is determined to be more than minimal risk, then the full REB must review and discuss the protocol at a monthly meeting. For this reason, you may expect that greater than minimal risk reviews will take longer, perhaps as much as 6 weeks, so you should plan accordingly. Since any risks posed to participants must be justified by corresponding benefits, you will be asked to describe the possible benefits that your study may yield. Benefits may be to the participants personally as a result of being in the study, or else may be to society in general by the production of useful new knowledge. As we have seen, the process of ethics review is proportionate to the level of risk posed to participants. Risk may be seen as a function of the harm that might occur and the probability or likelihood of that harm occurring. So when planning your research, think not just about what bad things might happen, but also whether the possibility is great or remote. There are, of course, different types of risks to which participants may be exposed. Physical risk is, of course, a possibility, but if you are seeking information from participants by survey, interview, or focus group, for example, we may be worried more about potential psychological or emotional harms. It can happen also that participants can suffer social harms, such as embarrassment or loss of reputation, legal harms, and economic risks, such as a loss of a job or inability to obtain insurance, and others if personal information becomes public or is accessed by or communicated to the wrong people. In planning your research, think about how you will identify appropriate participants to take part and how you will find contact information for them. Often this will be straightforward, but sometimes ethical issues can arise. How will you obtain contact information for prospective participants? If contact information can be found from some public source or website, then contacting those people is probably okay. However, if you are obtaining contact information from a non-public source, that can create problems. For example, say you wish to interview parents of children with some serious medical condition. If you were to somehow find email addresses for such parents from a non-public source, then such parents may be understandably upset to be contacted. They might reasonably ask, how is it that you have access to serious and sensitive health information about themselves and their child? So, you may wish instead to partner with some advocacy or other group that such parents may belong to and ask them to send out notices of your research, but not to give you any names or other identifying information. Then, your prospective participants can contact you to find out more about the research only if they want to, and can otherwise maintain their privacy. Similarly, if you are doing some of your recruiting by snowballing, that is, asking participants you already have to recommend other names of people who might be appropriate, then it is preferable to ask those people to contact the others and invite them to get in touch with you if they wish. This is better than asking for names and contact information for your prospective snowball sample. So the REB will want to know your plan for identifying and contacting prospective participants. They will want to see the poster or the text of your recruitment invitation to prospective participants and how participants will be asked to express interest in taking part. Again, this is not usually a problem, but it can happen that the researcher may have some undue influence over prospective participants, either because of a power relationship, such as supervisors over their employees, teachers over their students, and similar relationships, or because of the nature of the relationships. If you are recruiting friends, professional colleagues, and the like, they may feel some pressure to participate, even though they would not wish to participate otherwise. As I have said, valid informed consent must be free, informed, and ongoing. The general rule for adequate information to be given to prospective participants is that it must be all the information that a reasonable person would wish to have in order to agree or refuse to participate. This includes a straightforward explanation that the project involves research, that participation is voluntary, and that the participant may drop out of the study at any time without needing to give an explanation. The consent text must also explain the purpose of the study, the tasks or interactions that they will be expected to carry out, the risks and potential benefits of the research. The information must be explained in a way that is accessible and may be understood by the particular group being recruited. Further, remember that consent is not simply an event taking place at the signing of the consent form, but should be seen as a process, and the obligations of good faith and voluntariness begin with the process of recruitment and continues throughout the involvement of the participant in the study. Although the norm or default is for participants to sign a consent form, there are circumstances in which a form is unnecessary or perhaps impractical in the circumstances. So, for example, it may not be workable to have a signed form for an online survey. In that case, perhaps the consent language could be contained in the first page of a web-based survey with an I agree button that consenting persons can click, which would then take them to the pages of survey questions. A telephone or Zoom interview is another example where a signed paper consent form is impractical, so perhaps the consent script can be read to the participant and the person's agreement could be recorded either in research notes or in the audio recorded interview. Other options for consent are also potentially acceptable with a good rationale. This is a slide of the basic required elements of consent, which must be included in the consent form or consent text or script that is given to a prospective participant. I apologize, this is a bit of a busy slide, and you can pause the presentation to read these elements yourself. They are mostly fairly self-explanatory, but I want to say something about a couple of these items. First, on our Forms and Templates webpage, you will find a number of consent templates that you can use as guides to preparing your consent form, consent text, for example, to be used in the introduction to an online survey, or consent script, for example, for a telephone or Zoom live interview. These templates contain reference to these required elements, and the wording has been approved by the REB. However, remember that if there are any other elements of your particular study that a reasonable person would want to know in order to make an informed decision, then those must be included as well. I will talk a bit more about data collection and storage in a later slide, because the issues of privacy and confidentiality of the data collected is especially important. The second to last bullet refers to withdrawal and limitations on withdrawal. Clearly, the participant may withdraw during his or her research participation at any time. However, we generally require that participants may reconsider their participation and ask to withdraw their data even after their study session is completed. How long that withdrawal period can reasonably be may depend to some extent on the particular circumstances of your study and your research timelines. Obviously, this can't go on indefinitely because at some point you have to process and analyze your data and prepare your findings. So, the REB will ask for a period of time with which the participant can request that their data be withdrawn from the study. This should be a proposal made by you, the researcher. This period of time should generally be not less than a couple of weeks or a month, but maybe longer. If the data you collect is truly anonymous, so that the data cannot be withdrawn later, since there is no way to associate a person with his or her data or responses, then this should be explained in the consent form. Finally, referring to the last bullet, you should seek the participant's consent if you will wish to recontact that participant, either for follow-up or as a possible participant in a future study. If you foresee the need to recontact the person, then you must ask for their consent specifically. In the context of research ethics, vulnerable people are conceived as those whose ability to give free and informed consent to participate in the research project is in some way compromised. So, children lacking sufficient maturity and judgment, persons with mental illness with disordered thinking, people with severe dementia, and others may not have the capacity to make informed decisions for themselves. We consider such people vulnerable to a reduced ability to give valid consent. And some people are compromised in their ability to give voluntary consent because of their position in general or their position with respect to the researcher. For example, prisoners and others in confined institutions may be subject to influences to agree to research participation when they would not otherwise do so. Students, where their teachers or professors are doing the research, may have a difficult time saying no, and people in the military or similarly structured institutions may also be unable to consent or dissent freely. In either case, the concern is to ensure that consent is capable, free, and informed. So, for people who lack the capacity to make free and informed decisions on their own, a substitute or surrogate decision maker may be needed to protect the person's interests. This may be the case with a child or a person with dementia, for example. If some people are constrained in their ability to give consent voluntarily, then perhaps a neutral person can be the one to approach the person for consent, and the teacher or supervisor, for example, can be shielded from knowing just who did or did not agree to take part. The REB will scrutinize your plans for safeguarding such vulnerable participants closely to ensure that consent is freely given. Although, of course, your obligation as a researcher is to describe the study truthfully and with adequate information. However, sometimes, to ensure that the scientific purpose of the study is met, the researcher must use some deception or must provide incomplete information to the study participant. This arises mostly in psychology studies in which full and completely truthful information about the study would predictably skew the participants' responses and frustrate the purposes of the study. The REB can approve such studies if the need for the deception is demonstrated, and you can see our conditions for that on the slide. But we generally require two additional steps. First, after the research intervention is done, the researcher must explain the deception or incomplete information to the participant in a debriefing. He or she must explain why the deception was necessary in order to answer the question validly. In addition, the participant must be offered the option of withdrawing his or her data from the study in case they feel that the deception or withholding of information was unethical or objectionable in some way. As I have said a couple of times, the privacy, confidentiality, and security of research data is something the REB takes very seriously. This slide presents some quite detailed information about different elements of this question. This topic can be quite complex, and I will only provide here a brief overview summary. As always, please get in touch with our office for more particular questions and a better understanding of REB standards with respect to data management. The general rule is that you should collect the minimum amount of data that you can, consistent with meeting the needs of your study. The data should be collected with as few identifiers attached as you reasonably can, and the identifiers that you do collect should be deleted from your study records as soon as that is practically possible. The data you collect, whether in digital or paper form, should be stored in a secure way. If these are paper records, then they should be ideally in a locked file drawer in an office that is secure. That is, in general, it's self-locked when not in use. For digital data, it should be encrypted, or at least password protected, with access limited only to those with an actual research need. In either event, we will ask you to describe your data management practices, including what data you will be collecting, details about how it will be stored, who will have access to the data, and when it will be destroyed or deleted. Having said that, the concept of proportionate review applies also to these data security rules. That is, if the data being collected and stored is of a benign nature, then our requirements with respect to privacy and safe storage will be correspondingly less stringent. The rules are still important, but we will look in a more rigorous way at the management of data that is sensitive, or that, if it gets out, more serious harm can be caused. In order to carry out some studies, the cooperation, permission, or support of some outside agency or organization may be required. This may be because you are asking an outside agency to help with identifying and contacting prospective participants, or because you need the premises or facilities of an outside institution in order to carry out the research, or you may need ethics clearance from outside bodies. Some institutions, including hospitals, school boards, Indigenous band councils, and others, may have their own ethics approval process or committees that must be from which approval must be obtained. The REB will generally require that such permission be secured prior to starting the research.